Hi everybody, and welcome back to our first video in Chapter 4, Activity-Based Costing. Okay, for activity-based costing, here we're going to understand the basic approach in activity-based costing and how it differs from conventional costing. So you'll remember conventional costing, we're using what we would call volume-based predetermined overhead rates based probably on labor hours or labor dollars or machine hours or something like that. Overhead doesn't occur that way. It occurs based on what we'll call how the costs are consumed by each product. So when the cost systems were developed in the 1800s, the emphasis was on simplicity because of a couple of things. One, cost and activity data had to be collected by hand, and all calculations were done simply on paper and pencil. And most companies, too, produced a limited variety of similar products. So there was very little difference in the overhead costs consumed by each product. And also, what they don't show on this slide is that overhead contributed a smaller proportion of the costs than they do today. More automation, et cetera, accounts for that difference between the 1800s and modern days. So let's take a look. A plant-wide overhead rate is a single overhead rate that's used throughout the entire factory. You've been through that. So we use direct labor, usually hours, have often been used as the allocation base for overhead because A, direct labor hours and information was already being recorded. B, direct labor was a large component of product costs. And C, managers believed direct labor and overhead costs were highly correlated. The disadvantage of the plant overhead rate are that today direct labor may no longer be a satisfactory base for allocation of overhead. Why? Number one, most companies sell a large variety of products that consume different amounts of overhead. Number two, as a percentage of total costs, direct labor has been declining and overhead has been increasing, as I mentioned in the previous slide. Many of these growing overhead costs may not be correlated with direct labor. And then number three, technology advancements have reduced the cost and complexity of gathering diverse sources of data. All right, a plant-wide overhead allocation system, therefore, may not be optimal for many companies in today's business environment. However, it should be noted that activity-based costing is more expensive and more complex to implement and to use. Okay, so we can also maybe split it a little bit with departmental overhead rates. Many companies have a system in which each department has its own overhead rate. It would seem logical, therefore, that in a machining department, we might use machine hours to allocate overhead. In an assembly department, we might use labor hours to allocate overhead. And in the shipping department, we may base that on other measurements. So the allocation base is going to depend on the nature of work performed in each department. In the machining department, overhead may be based on machine hours, but in the assembly department, overhead may be based on direct labor hours, as I mentioned. All right, disadvantages. Departmental rates will also not correctly assign overhead in situations where a company has a range of products and complex overhead costs. The departmental approach relies on a single measure of activity as the allocation of base, while some overhead costs may be caused by factors that are not directly proportional to the volume of production. Notice that terminology, volume of production. Labor hours, machine hours, or volume of production. Activity-based costing is used to account for these other factors and more accurately assigns overhead costs to products. Okay, so we call in the activity-based costing process, we call cost objects products, usually, for our customers. And we have activities that consume resources. And as those consumption of resources occur, we incur the cost in overhead. So what we need to do then is determine the activities that cause the consumption of overhead. So some examples of activities would include setup time on machines, the cost of admitting hospital patients, billing customers, opening a bank account. Okay, so an activity cost pool then is a cost bucket, as it's called, in which costs related to a particular activity are accumulated. Then as we accumulate those activities, then we have an activity measurement, and that expresses how much of the activity is carried out and is used as the allocation base for applying overhead costs. We determine a predetermined overhead rate for each of these activity cost pools. Okay, that's the underlying methodology. So here, activity-based costing do have some similarities to job order costing. For each activity in isolation, this system works exactly like the job order costing system described in our previous chapters. A predetermined overhead rate is computed for each activity and then applied to the jobs and products based on the amount of activity consumed by the job or product. So the challenge then is to select a reasonably small number of activities that explain the bulk of the variation in overhead costs. Activities are usually chosen by interviewing a broad range of managers to find out what activities they think consume most of the organization's resources. So, if we look at related activities, they're frequently combined to reduce the amount of detail and record-keeping costs. For example, several actions may be involved in handling and moving raw materials, but these may be combined into a single activity titled material handling. So an activity dictionary here defines each of these activities that will be included in the activity-based costing system and how the activities will be measured. Okay, so there's a hierarchy of activities here. We have the unit level, the batch level, the product level, and the facility level. And by generally classifying these activities, it gives you a better idea as to how to allocate the activities that are used. So let's look at the unit level. That's the easiest one to understand. Here, If processing is done on machines, like machining would be an example of that, then we can easily use machine hours to allocate overhead. Now, if we do a lot of assembly work by hand, then maybe direct labor hours is a good choice for that activity measure. But if we use a lot of factory supplies, then we maybe look at how many units that we produce to allocate how many supplies are used. For example, if I'm teaching at a university level and I want to know how much paper is used, that's going to be a function of the total units produced, and the total units produced are students. So the more students I have, the more paper I'm going to use. Okay, anyway, pardon my crude factory supplies analogy there. Okay, so if I move from unit level to batch level here, we're going to look at processing purchase orders. Processing purchase orders takes a little time. They are sometimes very complex. So we can look at the number of purchase orders processed and the cost associated with that and use that as an activity measure, the purchase order processed. Similarly, we can use the production orders. We can use setting up equipment. We can use the number of setups. If we handle materials, we can use the pounds of materials handled. Now, if we jump from batch level to product level here, if we test new products, we can use testing time. If we administer parts inventory, we can look at the number of part types. And if we maintain inventories of parts, we can look at the hours of design time to create those inventories. Okay, then if I move to the facility level, I'm looking at general factory administration and maybe plant building and grounds, and perhaps we use direct labor hours to allocate that. In some cases, if we have maintenance people cleaning up the areas, the different departments, we could use the square footage in each of those departments. Okay, so let's look at stage one, various manufacturing overheads. And here's our first stage cost assignment. We have the labor-related cost pool. We have the machine-related cost pool. We have the machine setup cost pool, the production order cost pool, and the parts administration pool, as well as the general factory cost pool. Okay, so now how do we allocate those little beauties? Well, how we would do that is we would look at the labor-related pool, and pretty logically we would use dollars of direct labor hours, for example. Dollars per direct labor hour, I should say. If we look at machine hours, we could look at dollars per machine hour. For machine setups, we could use dollars per setup. For production orders, we could use dollars per order. And if we were to use parts administration, we might use the part types. And then in general factory cost pool, we'd use dollars per machine hour potentially, or square footage, or a number of other possibilities. All right, so that would give us our unit level activity, our batch level activity, product level activity, and facility level activities of those differing cost pools. That looks like a good place to stop this video. And when we return, we'll take a look at how we would use that in actually allocating costs to products. Until that time, bye for now.